70 years ago, on June 25th, war broke out between the two Koreas as northern forces illegally crossed the 38th parallel, attacking the south with Soviet tanks, artillery and aircraft. It was this war that brought Brigadier Brian Parritt to the Korean Peninsula in 1952 as a second lieutenant of the Royal Artillery of the British Army. As a young gunner officer, he saw action in one of the Korean War's most fiercely fought battles near the border, continuously beating back Chinese soldiers from advancing to Seoul. Brigadier Parritt, who is now retired, served nearly 4 decades in the army and went on to become a senior intelligence officer and defense advisor. He is the only British citizen to have been awarded South Korea's Order of Woran, received in 2018 by the president. His memoirs of the Korean War in his book, Chinese Hordes and Human Waves, is personal, deeply touching and also enlightening, and we're incredibly privileged to have him here as our guest today. Hello, Brigadier Parritt. Thank you so much for joining us. How are you today?
Fine, thank you, Sion. Fine, thank you.
Well, it's been quite a long time since you first arrived here in South Korea. In 1952, December, you arrived in Busan, and actually you were a young gunner officer for the British Army, and you'd been preparing pretty much all your life to become a soldier, and you graduated from the very prestigious Sandhurst Academy in the UK. Now, earlier that year in 1952, you'd actually applied for the 20th Field Regiment, knowing that it may go to Korea. So what made you decide, what made you choose to fight this war that was so far from home?
Well, as you've said, my father was in the Royal Artillery, my grandfather and my great-grandfather were all in the Royal Artillery. So it was my whole aim in life was actually to become a soldier in the Royal Artillery. And the Korean War had broken out, which I felt was a terrible thing for the South Korean people. And so wanting to be a soldier and to really be in action, I wanted to take part in the Korean War. It was a fairly simple decision.
And well, when you arrived here, you previously commented that it was very dark and desolate when you arrived in the port city of Busan. And you spent your Christmas here in 1952 and the very harsh winter months faring the brutally cold weather on the front line near the 38th parallel. How did you get through the very chilly and the particularly tough days? Was there anything that you or your colleagues did to really keep your spirits up and, of course, keep your temperatures up as well?
Yes, I mean, arriving in Busan at that time, the word comes to mind of devastated. It was a tragic situation, the damage and the poverty and the crisis of the country at that time, and then the long train journey from Busan up to Jeonbu and a truck driving up for the Christmas day, which was not celebrated at all. It was just, I think we had an extra tot of rum with our tea, but Christmas was not a Christmas, really, 52 for us.
So you were a second lieutenant in the Baker Troops, which was posted behind the ridge called the Hook near the 38th parallel. And the Battle of the Hook that you participated in was deemed one of the deadliest of the Korean War, and it's actually been compared to battles from World War II. You were selected by your battery commander back then to take part in a highly dangerous attack in the third battle of the Hook, and you got wounded in the process. Could you tell us more what the stakes were, how you survived, and also how you recovered from your wound?
Yes, certainly. I'd like to say before I begin that personal story, just to set the scene, because in 1950, when the North Koreans attacked, they had been supplied with weapons, artillery, tanks, logistics by China and Russia, whereas where the Americans had given economic aid, they had not given any artillery or tanks or logistics to the South Korean army. Though the South Koreans had warned about pile-up of weapons and tanks across the border, no action was taken. So it's not surprising that North Korean army with adequate drove the South. The Battle of the Hook takes place in 1953, by which time there's been a remarkable change, of course, in the competence and battle worthiness of the South Korean army. From being driven back then, they'd come straight up all the way, in fact, up to the Yalu. And in July 1953, were occupying a good 2/3 of the front line. The aircraft of the ROK Air Force, it takes a long time to train fighter pilots, but by the 53 July, they were in action with fighters. And from 1950, when it was just the Baekdu-san who took the first initial battle against the Navy, by July 53, were taking a full part in the sea battles. So it's in the scene of that we come to the Battle of the Hook, which is only one small part of the United Nations forces in July 1953. For us, it was an important battle because it was a strategic position overlooking the Samichon Valley. On the right were the United Nations forces, and on the left were the Chinese forces. And coming up to the ceasefire, we thought, they wished to take this important position, and therefore, although it was only a small area, they put in 3 regimental attacks on it to capture it. And they failed to do so. But you asked me about the wounded, and the little thing I was doing was that when the Chinese left their own positions to come up to the Hook positions, artillery fire, which we were controlling, had an enormous effect. The Chinese soldiers were in the open. We were firing these big tear shells that burst in the air, and that was devastating onto the advancing Chinese soldiers. So what they started to do was dig caves closer to our front line, where they were going to move troops in the day before the attack, and then that would be reduce the distance before they reached our front line. So it was decided to make a company attack one night to go out through the Samichon, up the valley there, to destroy those caves. And that's what I was the artillery officer conducting the fire for that attack, which was successful. The soldiers got through. They had charges on poles, and they poked them through and destroyed the caves. But I was wounded on the way up, and then was taken off back to Seoul to the hospital.
And well, you called it a little thing, but what you did here was, your involvement in the war was vital to keeping this capital of Seoul, where the studio is, in fact, safe from invasion. And you were in the midst of fighting between the two sides that were of the same nation, the same brotherhood, and also the same heritage. What were some of the tragedies you saw happening in battle as Koreans had to fight against Koreans? What did that situation make you feel as an observer and also a participant of the war?
Well, I think one of the things was that we were short of soldiers, and so the South Korean soldiers joined with our soldiers on the front line. They were taking a positive role, and it was a war by that time, static war, and therefore the fighting was done by junior soldiers and junior officers, majority of the time on patrols, sometimes fighting patrols, but majority of the time in standing patrols. That's coming out in the dark through in the middle of the paddy field, alone, and worried about ambushes and so on. And the South Korean soldiers, when they first arrived, of course, there was some apprehension how you were going to get on, the language difficulty. But after experience the togetherness of the patrols, the soldiers had to rely on, and a very warm bond of friendship came to between the South Korean soldiers and our infantry soldiers. And I think that made us feel that part of the support for the South against the aggression of the North. We did feel part of the community of South Korea against the wickedness of that aggression.
And the news of ceasefire then must have been incredible. It must have been an incredibly joyous moment for all. And you actually had a rather meaningful encounter on the first day. Could you tell us more about that?
Well, the day before the ceasefire, the story goes that I was looking out of the OP across to the Chinese lines, and I saw two Chinese soldiers laying a telephone line in the middle of the no man's land. So I thought, well, I'll just have a troop target my Baker troop, 4 guns. So I ordered 4 guns to fire, and to my amazement, it turned into a battery shoot, and then into a regimental shoot, and I was adding miles, yards and yards away from these 2 Chinese guys in order not to have drop shots onto our own line. And in the end, the whole of the corps artillery fired on these 2 guys, miles behind them. But on the morning of the ceasefire, the night before, when that was a dramatic moment, we were told that it was 10 o'clock that they were going to have the ceasefire, but we were told that, but of course we wondered whether the Chinese knew that it was going to be that way. And then at 10 o'clock suddenly was the plot, which was what we hated, the mortars, but in fact it was the reds and green berry lights. So a huge cheer went up, and we knew that the Chinese had accepted the ceasefire. And the morning afterwards, and I sat with the platoon commander on top of the dugout. We'd lived like rats for so long, and he said, let's go down into the valley. And so the 2 of us went down through the wire into the valley, and suddenly round the corner, up popped these 2 Chinese guys, which, all 4 of us stared whether we were carrying weapons. But when we realized we weren't, it was all smiles and shaking of cigarettes. So it was a funny end to the war. But a story I'd like to say is that in the days following that ceasefire, I went with the South Korean driver down to Uijeongbu to get rations. And on the way down there, just outside Uijeongbu, there was a crowd of people demonstrating. So I said to the Korean guy, what are they demonstrating about? And he said, they're demonstrating about the end of the war. So I said, what? But he said, yes. I mean, you did, West came and divided. It was before you came. You draw the 38th parallel. I know that General Pak Sum-yuk and Dr. Syngman Rhee, when we got to Seoul, would have liked to have gone on up to the Yalu and liberated the whole of Korea. But for political reasons and the West not wanting to continue the fight, we'd got this border, and so I can understand. And it made a big impression on me that what the Korean driver said, you're going to go home, but you're leaving us with a divided country. And that rankled and bothered me ever since.
Well, I suppose they do say that war is a continuation of policy, but, well, you said, though, looking back, that you said in your book that it was a war worth fighting for the freedom of the South Korean people. So, how does it feel for you to look at South Korea today? I mean, what do you think is one of the most significant traits of the country that made the battles and the hardships worthwhile for you?
Well, first of all, that is the spirit of the South Korean people. I mean, that little things, that hospitality. I remember going into one little village and an old gentleman came out and he went in and brought out some rather withered apples, which was a very good thing to do. So it was always a warm feeling for the South Korean people. And when I went back on the revisit, which were well looked after and so on, it's amazing. When we were there, there was one broken bridge over the Han River. And when I went back, I think there were 33. It's a modern metropolis. the industry, the education of the university, Samsung, the shipbuilding, and that South Korea is a donor country in charities. It is an amazing story, and I'm delighted and proud that I took a little part in helping to preserve the independence and freedom of such a remarkable country with such a long tradition of heritage of art. And we've taken to the Seoul Museum, which is a remarkable museum of the treasures of the ancient Korean people. Now, it's a big factor in my life, which you gather, that making such a small part in helping to preserve the freedom of the South.
Well, it was through your efforts that these legacies were preserved and modernity was achieved. And you pointed out in your book that actually the Korean War could have been prevented had there been timely diplomacy or intelligence. And while the fact of the matter is the Korean War is still ongoing, and formally ending it is out of the hands of the South Korean people. Do you believe that the two Koreas could still one day unite? And what do you hope to see in order to build lasting peace here on the Korean Peninsula?
I'm quite sure there'll be a reminder. It reminds me, you know, we fought in the Cold War, and there were the East Germans, and the East Germans were the baddies. But if you asked anybody in UK today, for example, is Angela Merkel an East German or a West German? They wouldn't know what a silly question. Of course, it's Germany. And I believe in the end, that ancient country of Korea, with all its heritage, will one day be united. But I think you have to be cautious at the present moment with the shenanigans that go on in the north. But no way again will South Korea be attacked and defeated by the North. I'm quite sure about that. The armaments, the spirit and the competence of the Republic of Korean forces in every aspect is so strong and passionate that never again will the country be dominated by Japan or anybody else.
Well, we want to remember and honour the more than 81,000 brave British men who risked their lives and sacrificed the days of their youth to liberate South Korea. And we, of course, have to remember the 1,078 British soldiers who died so that Koreans could live and enjoy the privileges we have today as a modern democracy. Brigadier, thank you so much for your time today, and we hope you stay healthy and well amid this pandemic.
Thank you, and may I wish you and all South Koreans a happy, happy life.
Thank you so much, sir. And to our viewers, as always, thank you very much for watching.